Let's come back and let's begin with this observation. Genius though he was, Jung was dead wrong. The errors are not his errors. The flaws are not his flaws. They belong to his time. The person working on trying to understand scientifically through a scientific history, the first person to essay this and to try to do this was Henry Adams. Henry Adams' great-grandfather was John Adams, the second president of the United States. His grandfather was John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States. And his father was Francis Adams, who was the American ambassador to England during the Civil War under Lincoln. And Henry Adams grew up in one of the most distinguished households in the United States. And he was bothered by the fact that everyone always was talking about Jefferson and the crisis of the War of 1812 under his chosen successor, James Madison. And then it carried on to James Monroe, so that in effect Jefferson had 6 presidencies, 6 elections, quarter of a century, and by the time his grandfather came into office, the scientific qualities of John Quincy Adams were not recognizable, and he only survived one term, and was defeated the next term by a man who rode his horse into the White House in victory, Andrew Jackson, a Kentucky ruffian general who changed the nature of the American experience from a Jeffersonian republic to a free-for-all. From the Lewis and Clark expedition of the Louisiana Territory to go west, young man, and take as much as you can, fast as you can. It's all open. Land for free. Never mind that there are Indians and tribes. If they get in the way, we'll move them, and he did. Henry Adams wrote a 9-volume history of the United States under the presidencies of Jefferson and Madison. And as he did so, he became more and more upset by the fact that what's happening here is a larger scale. It isn't just America. It isn't just the United States, vis-a-vis the old world. It isn't that the new world is different from the old world. It's just a different venue. But something else is happening. And it came to him because he was used to traveling in Europe, used to languages and so forth. He was on the coast of France traveling. Henry's wife was Clover, whom he loved. And Clover was an excellent horsewoman, etc., friend, wife. After Clover died tragically, Henry Adams became a recluse. lived in Washington, D.C., and hardly went anywhere. But with Clover on the French coast, they were visiting at low tide Mont Saint-Michel, out on the sands off the coast, and with low tide one could walk out. And something about Saint-Michel being periodically an island, not a part of Europe, but apart from it, like an island. And he carried that impress, and when he and Clover went further on their trip and went into France, south of Paris, they were coming to Chartres Cathedral, and across this huge field with yellow blossoms, it was that time of the year, there was the island of Chartres Cathedral rising out of the land, rising out of history. And it hit Henry Adams like a sledgehammer that there are forms to history. There are histories of history that follow cycles. And he was enough of a savant in many things that he took the physics of elements, as it was known in the early 20th century, and he applied the phases as a rule of phase of the way in which all processes happen: gas, liquid, solid, etc. And he wrote a beautiful little essay called The Rule of Phase Applied to History. But the big volume that came out from him that has been a classic, and it's been in print ever since, and all kinds of fancy editions. It's called Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres. And he says there is a form to the time cycle of civilization. And it has a pinnacle. It has an apex. It has an island like Chartres or like Saint-Michel that stands up and marks the time. And when the time is marked, that is what everyone has been calling for a long time, a millennium. And that millennium is independent of politics. It's independent of the power that people or groups of people or whole hordes of people think they have. Because when the time has come, the bell has struck, that's it. And that the millennium is the peak, and what happens that was a build-up for that whole millennium is now at the millennium, and it will run down from that peak until it reaches zero. And so in the rule of phase applied to history, he was too ill to really have it published and offered, and he was old and a curmudgeon and so forth. Washington, D.C. It just disappointed him no end what had happened to everything. And he had a very intellectual, excellent brother, Brooks Adams. And after Henry's death, at oddly enough, the end of World War I, the Great War, he published a volume of the last essays of his brother, and it's called The Degradation of Democracy. And the rule of phase applied to history is the number one pivot in that book. Brooks Adams was taken, by the way, in his own researches with utopian communities in America, the transcendentalists and so forth, and he was really quite an expert at that. So that Henry Adams, at the end of his life, had given a timeline for civilization. And he said the civilization in this timeline is under the constraints of universal physics and chemistry. And its timeline runs out in the 21st century. It runs out in 2118. Because it will no longer have any kind of psychic energy whatsoever from its pinnacle of Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. It will be completely bankrupt, devoid of energy. Forget the money, forget the power, forget everything else. There will be no juice. So we find ourselves in 2014. 2014 is only 4 years away from that, on the cusp of something which is endgame. One of Samuel Beckett's great works is entitled Endgame. Not Waiting for Godot, but Endgame is the one. Jung, in his flaw, it was not his flaw. It was a flaw that was seeping in all these centuries, like a bad habit become a bad characteristic, passed on by bad education, passed on by bad generations, becoming worse, so that there's no way that anyone is free to not be in that devolutionary swirl. You can have all the genius in the world, and the critique now is, look at all the Silicon Valley guys and girls. Look at all they have done. And they're turning out to be just like the robber barons of the 19th century. Just like those who commandeered the Industrial Revolution for their political economy, the railroads, et cetera, the banks. The Silicon Valley guys, those corporations, are the robber barons of the 21st century. They're doing the same thing. It's a critique that has been uttered now again and again. Here's where Jung tuned in to the flaw in Answer to Job, thinking that it was a brilliant insight on his part and not understanding that he was buying into an ancient flaw that was there a couple of thousand years before. That was there because it was cured a couple of thousand years before, but it was uncured because the understanding of the cure went back carelessly to an original flaw, and that original flaw seemed like we're cursed. It had two parts. Here's the first flaw. He's talking about Cain and Abel. One can therefore regard Abel as the imperfect prototype of God's Son who is about to be begotten in Mary, just as Yahweh originally undertook to create a synonic equivalent of himself in the first man, Adam. Adam, so now he intends something similar, but much better. The extraordinary precaution measures above mentioned are designed to serve this person. The new Son, Christ, shall be, on the one hand, a synonic man like Adam, mortal and capable of suffering, but on the other hand, he shall not be, like Adam, a mere copy, but God himself, begotten by himself as the Father and rejuvenating the Father as the Son. As God, he has always been God, and as the Son of Mary, who is plainly a copy of Sophia, he is the Logos, synonymous with nous, the mind. The Logos is the word, but it's the word in a saying that has a pithy unity to it, so it becomes a saying. The first classic collection of such sayings was, they collected sayings of Pythagoras. And the Greek term for those sayings, they all begin the same way. Ipsa dixit, he said. It's like the Confucius say Chinese desserts. He is the Logos synonymous with nous, who, like Sophia, is a master workman as stated by the Gospel according to St. John. This identity of mother and son is borne out over and over again in the myths. And so Jung goes to the myths. If you go to the myths, and you go mystically to the myths, you have a flow which the myths have. But if you go to the myths as an intellectual structure of a mythology, and you're studying the myths as symbolic types, then one does a conversion and the mind becomes attuned to the subtleties that are not tended to in myths because they're not subtle. They're natural, that have a ritual base that goes along with the way in which the natural seasons work, animals work, plants work. And yes, they can be integrated into symbols, and they do integrate into symbols quite naturally. But when the symbols become their own boss, their own taskmasters, and go back, they realize that this study of myths has given us an insight that if we change and control the ritual base, the myths will begin to conform to how the rituals are contained and constrained. So if we get obedience to our doctrines, we will have the right myths, and our integral understanding will win the day hands down. Everyone will understand this is the way it works. Not that it's natural, but this is the way it works. At least this is the way it works now for you and you and you and everybody, including us, and we control the way it works. We're human plus. Jung says, in these matters, the identity of a non-temporal, eternal event with a unique historical occurrence is something that is extremely difficult to conceive. He must, however, accustom himself to the idea that, quote, time is a relative concept and needs to be complemented by that of a, quote, simultaneous existence. In the bardo or pleroma of all historical processes, what exists in the pleroma as an eternal process appears in time as an aperiodic sequence. That is to say, it is repeated many times in an irregular pattern. For example, Yahweh had one good son and one who was a failure, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau. And he goes on in that mode. And so one begins to have a typology, a theory of types. And just about the time that this theory of types, Jung's Psychology of Types, was his first great book. It came out in 1921 in German. It was about the time that Bertrand Russell was writing at the pinnacle of the philosophic filigree of having completed, with Alfred North Whitehead, Principia Mathematica in 3 volumes. Cambridge University Press, they're thick, dark blue with gold stamping. They look like the Torah itself. Their Principia Mathematica was more precise than Newton's Principia Mathematica, but so difficult to read, you cannot read it aloud. You cannot lift it off the page. So graduate students, undergraduates just hear about it apocryphally. Graduate students cannot read Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, just like no one could read Newton's for a long time, many generations. So they give you sections 1 through 56 of the first volume, and Cambridge published it in paperbound, so it was nice that graduates who pretend to have read it now can say, well, it says here in Principia Mathematica, and they go to some kind of a page, and, well, this is that. And the person who punctured holes, poked a finger in the eye of Bertrand Russell was Ludwig Wittgenstein. That this is not only not true, this is phantasmagoria. The only thing you can do with this is hone your criticality to include everything. One can understand to any kind of filigree whatsoever the nuts and bolts of everything. But it becomes increasingly self-destroying, useless, especially when one begins to understand that nuts and bolts are made out of atoms and that the atom can be split. It has subatomic particles and many subatomic particles, and they have a very strange way of being atomic, that they have a nucleus, the protons and the neutrons, and they are surrounded by the electrons in shells, in energy levels, but that the relationship of the electrons to the nucleus has a very strange kind of comportment. And one of the best little books ever done on that was done quite a while ago. Let's see, it was published in 1984, published by Academic Press, The author is Gad Fisher, Department of Chemistry, Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and Beersheba, Israel. It's called Vibronic Coupling. Subtitle, The Interaction Between the Electronic and Nuclear Motions. Not the electrons and the neutrons and protons, but the nucleus and the electron cloud in its striations in their dynamics. In their dynamic. Whoa. Now you have something that is very akin to that fourth state, that fourth phase of matter, a plasma. Because when you add plasma to gas, liquid, and solid, with all four together, you have a combo, and now you have jazz. You no longer have a easy hierarchy, but you have an interplay of instruments that can improvise. Yeah, you can recognize this riff or that. It is jazz. And it is a spontaneous, not a composition, but a composingness that goes on while you're playing. This is different. It's not only radically different, it is twice over radically different. It is differential kaleidoscopically. And if you can't learn to learn, there's no way to get it at all. It isn't less than zero. It isn't a little bit more than zero. It is perfectly zero, and that, to misquote, as everyone does, Shakespeare, that's the rub. It is perfectly zero. The Sanskrit word for zero is ka, and there are many other words in Sanskrit that mean zero, but ka means perfectly zero. Not a 0 point. 0 points vanish into zeroness. A zero field is empty, but fertile. The fertility of a vacuum is just beginning to be understood in the 21st century, and that it goes back to the way in which subatomic particles all have something called a half-life. And many of the really subtle subatomic particles have such short half-lives. Well, what happens to them? They disappear. And then they appear, or disappear, or appear. They can go in and out creatively from a zero field empty vacuum comfortably. Doesn't bother them at all. Yes, they can decay into other particles, and those particles can decay. They all have the ability, the whole vibratorial universe has the ability to disappear into zero and to reappear into unlimited infinity. Let's come to something that is bordering on the profundity. It isn't just the West, but it's the East also that has this problem. And this problem is highlighted. This is a book by an Indian lady, dark-skinned Indian lady, who taught at the Deccan College in Pune, and among other places, and also at the University of Chicago, in Chicago. Her name is Malati Shenge, This volume is Language of the Harappans from Akkadian to Sanskrit. I have included a page from it in the illustration in your notes, just before the pages about beyond divisions. Since the birth of synthetic biology almost 15 years ago, the field has splintered into diverse tribes of scientists, all attempting to endow cells with new abilities. So there are tribes of human plus synthetic biology scientists, and their game is afoot, emphasis game. Time to settle the synthetic controversy. In this issue of Nature, the international publication for 120 some years of science, time to settle the synthetic controversy. If synthetic biology is to thrive, the world needs to decide now how the field should be regulated and supported, says Volker ter Meulen in the Worldview editorial in the same volume. This is getting towards Henry Adams' zero energy of civilization. It's getting towards the zero field, not a 0 point. Here's a whole conference on Secret Space Program and Breakaway Civilization Conference. And the whole quotation that heads the brochure for it: 0 point energy is the power source behind the secret space program. June, San Mateo, California, near Silicon Valley. We're at the edge of the Okefenokee swamp. I guess I never heard of Pogo or Walt Kelly, that there are really interesting characters that are at home in that Okefenokee and who seem very gentle, but they are profoundly unaffected by the phantasmagoria. Like Brer Rabbit, Pogo can always walk free. His friends, among them a little bug, and the little bug's usual phrase in a little cartoon bubble is just fine, J-E-S, just fine. And another one time was, we have met the enemy and he is us. She portrays in here that Sanskrit is not at all the language of the Aryans. In fact, there was no Aryan invasion that then came and took over and then brought their language Sanskrit into play. It took her almost, she's 80 now, she's still alive, still working. Took her almost a whole lifetime to be able to write such books and to show that the original civilization in India, in the whole, not just the Indus Valley, the river system, all the way down to the Arabian Sea, but all the way along the Baluchistan coast, all the way to the entrance to the Persian Gulf, and all the way north over the passes through the Hindu Kush into Central Asia, everything from Oman to Samarkand, from Kabul in Afghanistan to the Ganges and beyond in central India, was a long-standing civilization of what usually is called racially the Dravidians, the black Indians. But that they had a working relationship in the 3rd millennium BC with the whole development that was happening in Sumer, especially after it's transformed into the Akkadian trading routes that went all the way from what is today, they don't call it Bombay anymore, Mumbai. All the way from Mumbai to Cyprus. That the Indian civilization and the Akkadian North Semitic civilization were in contact for hundreds of years, both at the apex of their civilizations. That the Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro was so sophisticated, they did not need to have standing armies. They did not have to have a warrior class. So when there were waves of Avestan-speaking peoples coming in, not only from Central Asia, but from Afghanistan, because the pressure on Iran and Afghanistan was from Anatolia, from the Hittite empire that finally took over Egypt and was taking over all of Iran and into Afghanistan, were pushing those Central Asian Avestan-speaking people into India. In fact, they came in two different waves because there were two different pushes by the Hittite empire. They brought their Avestan language, but they were met by a sophisticated language that was native to India and already had been toned to the Akkadian of this great swath of trading empires, not empires so much, but confederations of an enormous quality, and that those people spoke a language that brought some Aryan words into play from the Avestic, but many of their words already were from the Akkadian, and most of their syntax, most of the grammar was native to what we would call Black India. And when we come next week, we'll take a closer look at the way in which this is of enormous importance, because it changes the time forms of civilization from being inevitable to being creative, if we can remember to do it. More next week.